watch over them and please bless them and help them through their many trials. Lord, as the flock, just help us to be on the lookout for people who are in need, and just help us to use the things that you bless us with to help those who are in need. Lord, please continue to watch over our spiritual leaders and just help them to continue to be good shepherds of your flock. It's in Christ's name that we pray. Amen. Okay, so this letter to the Ephesians, and today we are going to talk more about background. I don't know if we're actually going to get into text today, but as I usually like to do is to lay a bit of a groundwork so that we know all of the pieces and parts of the text that we are tackling here. So today is basically background. First thing that we want to talk about is authorship. So who wrote this letter to the Ephesians? And it is a letter. And so it's sometimes we are tempted to call these books of the Bible, and a lot of these in the New Testament are actually letters. And it's important for us to realize that they are letters. They're letters from a sender, and they are letters to a specific audience. And there is a specific reason why that sender is writing to that specific audience. And it's important to keep those things in mind. And so it's not just some manifesto that is inspired by God, but it is a specific person writing for a specific purpose. And so we're going to examine who wrote it and who was being written to today. It is Paul. Very good. And so Ephesians 1:1, it kind of tells us that, right? Well, our work here is done, right? We could just go ahead. So Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God, Ephesians 1:1. Paul is the author. But who is this Paul? Who is the one who is penning this? And Paul gives us a great write-up of himself in Philippians. And so if anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. And he talks about his resume in a sense. And so he says he is circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. But whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. And so this is Paul. In a nutshell, if we wanted one paragraph of Paul in his bio, I think this would kind of be it. And so Paul says that he is circumcised on the 8th day. So he has been a Jew since the beginning of his life. It's not that he converted late in his life, but he was from the very beginning. And so as early as possible, he had that sign of being a Jew. He is of the people of Israel, and so he is of people who came from Israel. He is a Hebrew. He is of the tribe of Benjamin, and so that was a source of pride for many people that were of the Jewish faith and the Jewish people, that they could trace their lineage to what tribe they belonged to. And you can think of the Jewish people being scattered throughout the world at this point in history, and sometimes brought back and sometimes scattered again. Some people lost track of that genealogy. They lost track what tribe they had originally come from, which one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so Paul was able to account for that. And so that's a source of pride for an individual who would be of the Jewish faith. And so he knew he was of the tribe of Benjamin. And he's not just any person in that Jewish faith. He is a Hebrew of Hebrews. And so out of the Hebrews, he is a Hebrew himself. And so it's like he is the cream of the crop, basically, or the cream of the cream, even. And so he is the best of the best among the Hebrew people, at least what he's saying here. And so he wasn't someone who just kind of played at it, but yet he was die-hard about his faith. And he was an itinerant Jew. He was, very fastidious in the way and very faithful in the way that he practiced that faith. As to the law, he's a Pharisee. And so he subscribed to that line of thinking, and that has a lot of different pieces and parts to that. I think that the biggest thing about the Pharisees is that they believed in a resurrection. Of course, Paul would at the point when he was writing this, but as Jewish people, that was a kind of a point of contention, whether or not there would be a resurrection of the dead or that there was even an afterlife. And the Pharisees believed that. And that kind of stirred up the way that the Pharisees thought, that if there is this reward in an afterlife and there is a resurrection to get there, then you need to do everything that you can in order to attain that resurrection. And so that's one of the main reasons why the Pharisees were so fastidious about keeping the law. They wanted to benefit from that resurrection. So Paul was a Pharisee, and so again, he was a Jew who kept a lot of rules, and was very important to him that he kept those rules. As to zeal, a persecutor of the church. And so he was so zealous about his Jewish faith that he was wanting to stamp out any competition of it. And so he was so zealous for God that he wanted to make sure that anything that he saw as a threat was destroyed. And so he persecuted the church because of that zeal. And so in that sense, that's a very negative thing. He was mistaken with that zeal. As to righteousness under the law, blameless. And so as far as keeping the precepts of the law, he tried very hard. And, I think we know truly that people can't fully keep the law. But yet, as far as just the pieces and parts of it, he was seen as a pillar of society. And so he had all of this going for him. And so he was the best of the best of the best in the Jewish faith. And so that would be a badge of honor. And that would be a very difficult and hard thing to give up. You have a very high and respected position within the faith, and you have carved out a niche for yourself. It would be very difficult to walk away from that, But verse 7, but whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. And so when he was set straight about what was true and what wasn't true and what God truly expects of us and our true way through Christ in order to gain salvation, Paul took all of that he had, that being a Hebrew of Hebrews, the best of the best of the best, and he counted that as loss because of Christ. And so he gave up a lot to be a Christian, and he weighed that, and he gave up that life in order for Christ. And so it was being a Christian and professing Christ was a very, very important thing for Paul, better than all of those material trappings that he had. Any other observations about Paul that I may have missed? Yes?
One thing about him is, when you said, who is he?
Mm-hmm.
He is a chosen instrument of God.
Good point. He is a chosen instrument.
Whether he was rich, poor, whatever,
mm-hmm.
he jumped on the wagon when he was stopped on the road to Damascus.
Right.
And when he heard Jesus' voice speaking to him,
mm-hmm.
he immediately turned towards the salvation because he realized he was pursuing God.
Right. And so, when he was set straight, just to repeat, he immediately jumped on that path that God had set before him. And so that goes into the idea of what Paul is saying here in Philippians, that he had zeal, but yet that zeal was misdirected. But as soon as God said, this is what is real, and you are persecuting me effectively, he jumped onto the correct side of that fence. He still maintained that zeal. And that's definitely Paul. And think of all of the bad things that happened to Paul that we see in the book of Acts. And that one is a book, not a letter. The book of Acts, that he endured all of that and continued and just dusted himself off and continued doing what was right because of that zeal. Good comment. Any other observations about Paul? Okay. So what's Paul's current situation? We kind of know his mindset. We know his values. But where is he at right now when he's writing this letter? Because that matters, right? And so this is where Paul is now. So Ephesians 3:1, for this reason I, Paul, a prisoner of Christ Jesus. 4:1, I therefore a prisoner for the Lord. And then again in 6:20, for which I am an ambassador in chains. And so Paul wasn't just roaming around doing what he wanted to do, living a carefree life. He was imprisoned when he was writing this. But Paul was imprisoned at multiple times and in multiple locations throughout his life, so we got to narrow this down a little bit. But we can see from internal evidence that Paul was imprisoned while writing this letter. But we have more evidence. So let's go to Ephesians 6:21. And he writes here, so that you may also know how I am and what I am doing, Tychicus, the beloved brother and faithful minister in the Lord, will tell you everything. I have set him to you for this very purpose, that you may know how we are, and that he may encourage your hearts. And so Tychicus is the bearer of this letter. He is the one who is delivering this letter, and he is the one who, also has more of the background, and he's going to help read it, and then he is going to share more of that situation with the people that he's delivering it to. And then again, we have in 2 Timothy 4:12, Tychicus I have sent to Ephesus. And so 2 Timothy being perhaps the last letter that Paul even writes, And we definitely know that Paul is in Rome when he writes 2 Timothy. And so if Tychicus had been with him at one point in time, it's likely that this imprisonment that Paul is talking about is in Acts 28, when he is imprisoned in Rome. And so this would have been before writing 2 Timothy, and I don't know exactly how long, but it would have been before that, but it would have been while he was at Rome imprisoned. And we typically think of someone being imprisoned that, they're behind bars and they've got the chain around their ankle and the big metal bar that's kind of keeping them in place and everything. But if we look at Acts 28, that Paul had a lot of latitude when he was under house arrest in Rome. And so he was set up in a home, and there was someone to guard over him, but he had a lot of freedom in order to have people visit him. He had a space to perhaps write. So he wasn't just locked in some dungeon somewhere. He had a lot of ability to write these letters, and he did write several letters from Rome. And so I think this is the most likely place that he was at. So he had some autonomy and some opportunity to do that. But that kind of answers the where, perhaps, but still not the when. And so when is this? We know it's Acts 28, but that's not exactly a date that we would be putting on our calendar. And so when is this? What year? And so in order to get to that, Acts 18 is the best place for us to start for trying to get a year. And so backing up to Acts 18, but when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, and so Achaia is the name for modern Greece, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal, saying, this man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law. So Gallio we know from secular history. And so the fact that Gallio is proconsul while Paul is in Corinth, it helps us to date that event. And then from what Acts says after that, we can therefore date those events. And so Gallio was actually proconsul of Achaia very briefly. And so there's actually an inscription in the city of Delphi. If you've ever heard of the oracle at Delphi, or it's actually Delphi, but there was a stone inscription that was made from Caesar. And so Caesar had found that place to be kind of deserted. The same temple worship wasn't being done at that point in history. And he was wanting to kind of revive all of that. And he leaves this inscription. And since Delphi is in Greece, part of that inscription gives a shout out to the guy who was the governor of that province, which would have been Gallio, during a very brief amount of time. And so this is a piece of this stone inscription that survives. It's called the Delphi Inscription. And there are 9 fragments of it. You can kind of see it's busted up into pieces. And here's one of them. And that probably looks like a bunch of gibberish because, all the words are shoved together. That's just the way that they wrote things. But luckily we have PowerPoint and we can highlight stuff. And so that word there, it says Gallion in Greek letters. And that's the name Gallio, just in Greek. And so there it is. And so in that part of the inscription, it mentions our pal Gallio here. And here is the whole inscription, putting all those 9 pieces together. Here's that in English. And so what that says is, Tiberius Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. Imagine writing checks with that every single time. Invested with tribunician power for the 12th time. So that's the 12th year of Emperor Claudius's reign. So that's a very specific point in history right there. We can date that. He was a pretty important guy as far as the world was concerned. So acclaimed imperator for the 26th time, father of the fatherland, really humble guy. For a long time have I not only well disposed towards the city of Delphi, but also solicitous for its prosperity, and I have always guarded the cult of the Pythian Apollo. But now, since it is said to be destitute of citizens, it was deserted, as L. Junius Gallio, my friend and proconsul, recently reported to me, and being desirous that Delphi should retain intact its former rank, etc., I order you to invite well-born people also from other cities to Delphi as new inhabitants. So he wanted to restore that glory to that city. But what's important to us is that this was the 12th year of Claudius's reign. And so he reigned from AD 41 to AD 54. We know that from history because there's plenty written about him. There's only one Roman emperor at any given time. Well, that's not exactly true later, but there's only one Roman emperor at this time. And we know from when he reigned and when he stopped reigning. And so the 12th year of his reign would be AD 52. And during that time, Gallio was proconsul. He was the governor of Achaia, that Roman province. And other sources indicate that Gallio was a proconsul for a very brief amount of time because due to illness. And so there's only a very short window of time that all of this stuff could be true. And so it's AD 52 is these events of Acts 18. And so from there, we can date a lot of other stuff. And so in AD 52, Paul is in Corinth, and he goes from Corinth to Antioch, and he roams, and he goes back to Antioch, and then he goes back out to Galatia and Phrygia. That's probably around AD 53. Acts 19, he stays in Ephesus for over 2 years. That's going to be important to our study here in a minute. So he is in Ephesus for over 2 years. It puts us around AD 55, 56. Then he's in Macedonia and Greece for over 3 months. He heads back to Jerusalem in AD 57, and where he is promptly imprisoned. He's arrested at the temple, and he's held unjustly for 2 years. And so now we're around AD 59, and he heads from Caesarea to Rome, and they leave late in the year, and in AD 60, he is then imprisoned in Rome. So it can't be before AD 60, really. And so we have all of these little pieces because of this little inscription that's found in Delphi. And so we know that just from this guy named Gallio, who we would probably just kind of read over in the book of Acts, And so we are right around AD 61, 62 is when most people think that the letter to the Ephesians was written. So, Paul didn't arrive at Rome and then just immediately, I've got to write the Ephesians. I've got to write to them. It might have been like a year later or so that he finally wrote them. So that's Paul's situation. So around AD 61, 62, he's writing from prison. As we see here, and we'll talk about more, that he was with these Ephesians for 2 years. So you get to know a group of people if you're with them 2 years. And this is just about, maybe 5, 6 years later that he's writing back to them and seeing how they are. These should be people that are very near and dear to him. But who are these people? And so we've talked about Paul, but now who are these Ephesians? Any questions about anything we've covered so far before I go? I want to give you guys an opportunity. Okay, so who are these Ephesians? Who is the audience of this letter? And so we've already determined that it is the Ephesians, again, 1:1, to the saints who are in Ephesus. Now, I don't really want to get into this, but believe it or not, this isn't as much of a slam dunk as what it looks like. But without getting into those details, this is written to the saints who are in Ephesus. And so what do we know about these people in Ephesus and the people that lived there? So first, I think we want to know where Ephesus is. Can we locate that kind of on a map? And hopefully we can kind of see enough. Evidently, the Grand Canyon kind of got into the way and kind of swallowed up part of Turkey. So Ephesus was across the Aegean Sea from Greece, and it's on the west coast of Anatolia, which is what we call Turkey in the modern day. So I don't think I can reach this with my laser pointer. If only I were just a little taller. But you can kind of see Ephesus is sort of in the center and on the right side. And so it's just across the Aegean Sea from Corinth, which was the capital of that province we were talking about, Achaia. Ephesus is the capital, at least in Paul's time, of the Roman province of Asia. And you can kind of see where it kind of fits in. There's Thessalonica a little bit between the two, but north. Rome is far to the west. And I don't know if you guys can see it, but on the very far lower right-hand corner, you have Caesarea and, more importantly, Jerusalem. So we can kind of see where Ephesus fits in. And so it's on the west coast of modern-day Turkey on the Aegean Sea. And in the 900s BC, so people from Greece, and we kind of think, well, why are these people really Greek? Why are they speaking Greek? They're in Turkey. Well, this is why. Around the 900s BC, colonists from Greece, they kind of sail across the Aegean Sea, and they're looking for another place to live. And there's some strife and some difficulty there, and so that causes them to seek out another place to call home. And they began to settle the western coast of modern-day Turkey. Now, if you're in Greece, then Turkey is going to be to the east to you. What Anatolia means in Greek is a rising up. And what rises up in the east every single day? The sun. And so they named that continent, that land, Anatolia, because it was east of them, it was the direction of the rising sun. And so they go across, they settle there, and that region that I have in green comes to be known as Ionia. And Ephesus was one of the cities started by those colonists. And so then, here's the city itself. circa 900 BC. So Ephesus is this, it's a port city. As you can see, it's just right on the coast there. And it's sort of at the end of this inlet. And it was, situated as a port. It would be very important to have people be able to get in and out of it. And it's situated on the eastern edge of this inlet. There is a river that flows through here called the Caister River. Modern, it's called Küçük Menderes. I'm probably butchering the Turkish on that because I have no idea. But that Menderes part means meandering. And so it's this really slow-moving, kind of meandering river, really prone to flooding. And that's going to be important over time. Not long after they started to reside there, the residents constructed a temple nearby to the goddess Artemis. And so that little black box right above the word Ephesus, that's where they constructed this temple. And that's going to be important to the history of this city. And so it's to the goddess Artemis, but it's kind of a combination of Artemis with this local fertility goddess. And they kind of combine them into one thing. And this building is called the Artemision. You can kind of see Artemis, and then a building dedicated to Artemis is called Artemision. And this site flooded, but it continued to be maintained over the years. And so in 550 BC, so we're fast forwarding a few years, a new temple was constructed because the place would just flood through. They needed to kind of build it up so it didn't continually flood. And so they built a much fancier temple on that site. Now in 356 BC, that temple burned down, and there's a really weird story about all of that. There's a guy who was an arsonist, and he burned that temple down so that everybody would talk about him and remember his name. And so as punishment, the people of the city said, well, nobody can ever mention his name again, but somebody did. But that temple burned down, but yet they replaced it with this huge, larger, more elaborate version of it. And this is the version of that temple that's famous, and this would have been standing in the time of Paul. And this temple was said to be 450 feet long, 225 feet wide, and 60 feet high. And it had more than 127 columns, really fancy. And at the time, this version of that temple, that was considered one of the 7 wonders of the world. And so, probably all read books and been fascinated about that kind of stuff when we were kids. The pyramids are the only one that's left, but this was one of them in that very town. Now, there's not a picture I can show you because none of it exists anymore, but it looked something like this. Now, this is the Parthenon. This is in Athens, but the same architectural concepts, the same style would have been kind of like this. And those numbers, I said it's this many feet wide, it's that many, we get numbers and our eyes kind of glaze over. It doesn't mean anything to us. This is a pretty big looking building, isn't it? That's pretty impressive looking. And if you kind of squint, if you look at the steps, you can kind of see these little ants, and those are people. The people are really tiny. The Artemision, in comparison, if we were to put that on the same side of this building, it would be 50% longer. So cut the building that you see in half and then tack it on to the end of that building. That's how long this would be. It's 50% wider. Again, cut the building in half lengthwise and then tack that on to the side. It would be that much wider. And it was 25% taller. So divide that thing by 4 and then tack that on to the top of the building that you see there. That's how big that temple was. It was huge. It was impressive. It was so cool that we might name it as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, right? And so, in fact, the guy who cataloged those wonders was a guy named Antipater of Sidon. And he saw this thing, and he was so impressed by it that he added it to that list, and he described it. I have set eyes on the wall of lofty Babylon, on which is a road for chariots. Remember the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And the statue of Zeus by the Alpheus, and the Hanging Gardens, and the Colossus of the Sun, and the huge labor of the high pyramids, and the vast tomb of Mausolus. These are all of those other 7 wonders of the world that this guy is talking about. I've seen all of that, but when I saw the house of Artemis that mounted to the clouds, those other marvels lost their brilliancy. And I said, lo, apart from Olympus, the sun never looked on aught so grand. And you can kind of picture what that would have looked like. That would have been an impressive building. And so obviously, this temple was a huge source of pride for the people that lived in that city. That was kind of their crown jewel. They were proud of it. they would have zeal for it. They would want to defend it. And if anyone tried to, ruin that experience or ruin that source of pride, they would want to go out and stop that. And from also a more practical standpoint, there'd be a lot of people who would want to see that building, wouldn't there? I mean, a lot of people would want to see such a grand location. And so this would have been a source of tourism for the city's residents and people coming into the city, visiting, spending money, et cetera, et cetera. And so it also, if it loses some of its splendor, it's going to affect their pocketbooks as well. And so this was a very central figure in the city of Ephesus. But there's practically none of this building left today. So this is what it looks like today. And there's not really much left. And this site wasn't even discovered until 1869. And so the water table rose. You can kind of see a little bit of the water there. And, it's just lost to history, basically. Not much of it remains. In fact, these few columns that are left were just gathered up and reconstructed from the rubble. And so the building had been kind of demolished and, its pieces and parts were incorporated into other structures. Nothing left of that grand thing today. That kind of maybe gives us a little bit of a lesson about putting our faith in material things, right? Even big temples like that are just basically ground to dust over time. And so maybe we need to put our faith and attention in things that are more everlasting than that. So we're in the 900s still. And so now fast forwarding to the 300s BC. And so around 290 BC, we're now in what's considered the Hellenistic period. And that Hellenistic period in Greek is considered when Alexander the Great comes around, and he conquers a lot of that world around there. And so this is, in 290 BC, is not long after the death of Alexander the Great. And one of the big features after he died was that his generals bickered amongst one another, and they fought for their little slice of that kingdom, that empire that Alexander the Great had set up. And so as that river brought in more silt, it created marshes around the city. And so the city of Ephesus, if you can see that black dot where the temple is, that's still where it was. And so that river brought in silt around it, and the city was situated near it, and it just wasn't a great place to live. Because of that silt, it kind of created some marshes, and those marshes created disease among the inhabitants. And it also made the harbor more difficult to use. And so because it was all marshy, you couldn't really park the boats there anymore. And so the ruler over that area is a man named Lysimachus, and he's one of Alexander the Great's generals. And so he says, you know what, we just can't work with this location. And so he moves the city of Ephesus 1.5 miles west. And as you can kind of see, Ephesus is now west of that temple. And so it's no longer right next door to that temple. It's still kind of close, but it's about 1 mile away. And so the inhabitants of that city, obviously, they hated him for it. It also didn't help that he renamed Ephesus after his wife. So for a short period of time, it was named after Lysimachus' wife, but then when he dies, they rename it again. And he also moves people from other cities and relocates them to inhabit this new city where he relocated it about 1.2, 1.5 miles away. And so Ephesus is now over 1 mile away from its famous temple. And so that's kind of why that happened. Then in 281 BC, this guy Lysimachus, who ruled over this area, he's defeated by one of those rival generals from Alexander the Great's empire, and it's a man named Seleucus. He's the one who ends up conquering everything that, like around Syria. And so that includes at one point in time, like Jerusalem and such. It came under that guy's rule. He's also one of the guys who was responsible for all the different cities named Antioch. That was his father's name. And so he named those cities after that. And so one of Lysimachus's officers, he ended up coming into power in a city named Pergamum. And he started what's called the Adelaide Dynasty that ruled over the kingdom of Pergamum. And so starting in this period, Ephesus was part of that kingdom of Pergamum. And so then fast forward again to 100s AD. And so this kingdom of Pergamum was the major power in this area, in this sort of western part of modern-day Turkey. And they were allies with Rome. And so by this time, Pergamum had become sort of a Roman client state. They were allies, but they were weaker. And in 133 BC, the king of Pergamum, a guy named Attalus III, he dies without an heir. And this Attalus chooses to bequeath his kingdom to Rome. And so the kingdom of Pergamum goes away, it's dissolved, and it becomes part of the Roman Empire. And there's some drama that happens, but the result is that Rome establishes the province of Asia in this territory in 129 BC. And Ephesus is located within this territory. So then we go another 100 years, and they're in 1 BC. And so in 27 BC, the Roman Emperor Augustus, he makes Ephesus the capital of Asia instead of Pergamum. And so this caused an era of prosperity, since Ephesus was both the seat of the governorship, and it was a seat of power for commerce. It was this port city. And so according to the historian Strabo, it was second in importance only to Rome. It's a guy's opinion, but he thought it was an important city. And the Roman population of the city might have been as high as 225,000 people. And so third in the size in the whole empire, behind only Alexandria. And so in addition to the cult of Artemis, the Romans also brought their own gods and goddesses with them when they kind of moved into town, and they also worshiped the emperor. And so you have this huge temple to Artemis that's worshiping, that kind of Greek goddess. You also have these people coming in and bringing their Roman forms of worship as well, including the worship of the emperor. And this would have been the city that Paul interacted with. But just kind of to see what happened to that city, this is now in 400 AD. Maybe you can kind of see from the map what's happening here. The city, it remained important in the early times of the Eastern Roman Empire, but it was second only to Constantinople. And you can kind of see that harbor, it needed to have a little canal built for it to be connected to the Aegean. And around this time, in 400 AD, the Artemision, that building we were talking about, it was closed due to the rise of Christianity. And it was maybe even destroyed. We don't even have a clear picture of that. And then in 600 AD, the city was partially destroyed by an earthquake, and the city's importance declined as that harbor silts in further. 1200 AD, when the Seljuk Turks conquered Ephesus in 1090, it was just a small village. It had kind of faded away from importance, and it was completely abandoned by the 15th century. And so you can see that harbor is completely silted in. This harbor city is now like 3 miles inland. And this is what it looks like in present day. And so the ancient site is like 3 miles. Even though it was a port city, it's 3 miles in now. And here's a satellite photo of that, just in case that's interesting. I wish I could laser pointer this. But kind of on the right side, about lower, you can kind of see it looks like kind of a rectangle, and then there's like a straight line kind of pointing out of it at like a 30-degree angle. That's the old harbor. And so you can kind of see there's this little lagoon that's left, and then the vegetation grows there a little bit more. That's that old harbor. And so it doesn't quite line up with the previous map, but you can kind of see that harbor there. And so the ruins of that ancient city are just to the east of that. And what's interesting is that same silt that doomed the city, that basically ruined all of the commerce in it, it also preserved a lot of the artifacts there and a lot of the structures there. And so here is the main road that kind of went out. And so this would be looking out to where that harbor was. The harbor, of course, isn't there anymore. But you can kind of see, even though that harbor would have been just at the end of those trees, the ocean is way much further away now. And this road actually wasn't uncovered until 2014, so just a few years ago. Here's an amphitheater that was there. And this is the main amphitheater at Ephesus. And you can kind of see that road in the bottom left. That's the road that we saw in the previous picture. And this amphitheater could hold 24,000 spectators, 24,000 people. Just as a comparison, the Paycom Arena downtown, that holds 18,000 people. And so this is ancient Roman technology, and it held more people. But my point in showing all of this is that it was a very important city. It was a very big city for its day. This is one of the houses there, and this is the ruins of it. You can kind of see these lavish mosaics and everything, and this is what's called the terrace homes there. And this was built in an incline between the lower city of the harbor and the upper city on the hill, and this is where the wealthier people lived. And so, as you can see by the mosaics that are there, it would cost a lot of money to do that. So that's Ephesus, and so kind of maybe gives us a picture of the people that Paul was writing to and the environment that those people would have lived in. And so any comments, questions, observations on that part? So what I want to talk about next is the occasion. And so what is the relationship between those two? Okay, so we know who the sender is. We know who the recipient is. But what is the environment? What was their relationship? Why would Paul take this time to write these people who were living in Ephesus? And so this is, again, from Acts 19. And so about that time, there arose no little disturbance concerning the way for a man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Artemis. Now, why would this guy make silver shrines to Artemis? And with that city that has that big temple to Artemis in it, somebody's going to visit that city and they're going to see this temple to Artemis. They're going to want like a souvenir to Artemis. But what happens when people stop worshiping Artemis? They're going to stop buying those things. They're going to stop being interested in those things. Verse 25, then he gathered together with the workmen in similar trades and said, men, you know that from this business we have our wealth. They are taking our jobs, basically, is what he's saying. Verse 26, and you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people, saying that gods made with hands are not gods. And there is danger not only that this trade of ours may come into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis may be counted as nothing, and that she may even be deposed from her magnificence, she whom all Asia and the world worship. So this guy named Demetrius, the silversmith who makes these silver statues, he's concerned Paul can't be sharing this message because people aren't going to be interested in Artemis anymore. They're not going to be interested in our gods and goddesses anymore. They're going to turn to something else. And it's not that they're disrespecting our religion. It's they're going to take away our livelihood. People aren't going to want this stuff anymore. And we've got to make money. We've got mouths to feed. And that was what was important to them. But what we can take away from that is that this is the same environment that these Ephesian people would have lived in. They would have been walking on eggshells a little bit, that their religion was contrary to the people that were around them. And those people around them would have wanted to defend their way of life, and they would have wanted to defend their livelihood. And so they would have to be very, very careful. And they probably experienced much persecution. This is 19:1, so backing up a little bit. And it happened that while Apollos was in Corinth, Paul passed through the inland country and came to Ephesus. There he found some disciples. And he said to them, did you receive the Holy Spirit when you believed? And they said, no, we have not heard that there's a Holy Spirit. And he said, into what were you baptized? And they said, into John's baptism. And so there are some Jewish people here in Ephesus. And so that's the only way that they would have known of John's baptism. More important, as evidence here, verse 8, and he entered the synagogue and for 3 months spoke boldly. So if there's a synagogue, then there has to be a Jewish presence there. And he reasoned and persuaded with them about the kingdom of God. But when some became stubborn and continued in unbelief, speaking evil of the way before the congregation, he withdrew from them and took the disciples with him, reasoning daily in the hall of Tyrannus. So he moved out of the synagogue and moved into this hall of Tyrannus. This continued for 2 years, so that all the residents of Asia heard the word of the Lord, both Jews and Greeks. And so this body of believers in Ephesus is comprised of both Jews and Greeks. And so it's a mixed congregation. And Paul was with them for 2 whole years. That's a lot of time to build a relationship and a rapport with a group of people. So, some of his soul was kind of there. Some of his care and concern with these people. He spent time with them. And so what does he do with that? A little later on, this is in Acts 20. And from Miletus, he sent to Ephesus and called the elders of the church to come to him. And when they came to him, he said to them. And so Paul is on his way back to Jerusalem here in chapter 20. And he stops at Miletus. Miletus is around 30 miles south of Ephesus. And so it's around a day's journey. So he sends for those church elders and they come to him. So 2 things, Paul really wants to see them and he tries to make it set up a situation where he sees them. Number 2, those Ephesian elders care enough about Paul and what he has to say that they took that 1 day's journey in order to go see him. Verse 36, and when he had said these things, he knelt down and prayed with them all. And there was much weeping on the part of all. And they embraced Paul and kissed him, being sorrowful most of all because of the word he had spoken, that they would not see his face again. And they accompanied him to the ship. So he spent 2 years with these people, and he gets to see them one more time, and there's all of this crying and feeling and tears because they won't ever see one another again. And so there is this very close bond, which makes Ephesians a little bit interesting here, because just about 4 to 6 years later, Paul writes in Ephesians, "For this reason, because I have heard of your faith in the Lord Jesus and your love towards the saints." Ephesians 3:2, "If indeed," or some translations say assuming, "if indeed you have heard of the stewardship of God's grace that was given to me for you." And so to these people that Paul spent 2 years with, these people that Paul cried with on the shores of Miletus, then just a few years later, he writes this, right? He hasn't just heard of their faith, he knows their faith. He's spent time with them. He's rolled up his sleeves and he has worked with them. He doesn't just assume that they have heard of God's grace, but he knows. He's the one who taught them. And on top of that, the letter doesn't even have any personal greetings to it. So if we go to the end of Ephesians, it talks about Tychicus is going to fill you in more, but there's no personal greetings to the people of Ephesus. And so it's kind of puzzling to some readers. And so there's a lot of various conclusions that people make on that. And so to kind of address that, I think it's possible that Ephesians is not written to just Ephesus only. It's not written to just the Ephesians, but it's a circular letter meant for the churches of Asia. If you are a regular Bible reader, could you please raise your hand? Thank you. And so it's a circular letter, meaning that it traveled around to different congregations within the province of Asia. And that province of Asia is shown here. And so it's not an uncommon thing. Galatians is addressed to a region. Galatia is not a town, it's a region. We're also familiar with Revelation. The very first part of Revelation is a circular letter that goes to various congregations in the province of Asia. And so I think that Ephesians is impersonal because it's a circular letter. It's not just to these people that Paul spent 2 years with, but it's with a lot of these various churches that are in this region. In addition to that, it could have even been delivered along with Colossians and Philemon, and I think there's significant evidence of that. And so Paul says in Ephesians, so that you may know who I am and what I'm doing, Tychicus is going to deliver this. And then Colossians has almost identically the same thing. Tychicus will tell you about all my activities. And so Tychicus is the bearer of both of those letters. And so Ephesians could have been circular, a more general letter. Colossians was specific to one congregation. And then Philemon, I think, was even delivered with the same letter because Onesimus is brought up in it. Philemon is then to one person. And so you can kind of take my word for it, but I can also maybe show a little bit of evidence here. And so, whenever you come to a difficult situation that you're trying to solve, whether or not these two letters are very similar, I think the common thing that most people do is write a computer program to analyze the words in a specific letter. And so here, I'm going to represent each letter by a dot. And so each dot equals one word in the original language. And so we can kind of take all of those dots for the letter of Ephesians, and we can arrange them here. And so that's all of the words of Ephesians. And so that's a lot of dots. That's 2437 dots to be exact. Ephesians has 2437 words, and that's a dot for each one of them. And when we write, we choose certain words. If I write a letter to somebody, I'm going to choose certain words. And when you write a letter to somebody, you're going to choose words that are perhaps different than I am. And so you can take all of the words of the letter and you kind of make a fingerprint out of that in a way. And so and even in the course of my life, in an individual's life, the words I would have chosen in a letter when I was in my 20s may be different than the words that I choose in my 40s. And so that fingerprint can even limit you to a single point in time. Oh, too soon. But here's Ephesians and 1 Peter. I'm going to try to wrap up really quick. And so side by side, we can see the words that both Ephesians and 1 Peter use together. And so those red dots are the words that are only found in Ephesians and 1 Peter. And there are two of them. So we can kind of look at the similarities. We can also look at the differences. And so these are the words that are used by one but not the other. Those get faded out. And so you can kind of see that there's some difference. So there are, of the words in 1 Peter, 28% of the words used in 1 Peter don't exist in Ephesians. So Peter uses different words than Paul does. But let's look at Paul to Paul. So here's Ephesians and Galatians. Galatians is one of the first letters written by Paul. Again, there are two words that are only used in those two letters. When we look at the differences, about 24% of Galatians is not used in Ephesians. So it's a little closer, but it's still different. And so there's about maybe 10, 15 years between Galatians and Ephesians. And so even Paul to Paul, there's some differences. Now we'll look at Philippians. So we're getting a little closer. Still only two words used by both of them. But we're at a higher percentage now. And so still like 22% of Philippians is in Ephesians. But now we look at Ephesians and Colossians. We went from two words that are used only in those two, but between Ephesians and Colossians, there are 11 words that are only used in those two letters and nowhere else in the entire New Testament. Those words were written by the same person, Paul, and they were probably written very close to the same time. If I fire off one letter to my parents, and I fire off a letter to them, and then at the same day I write a letter to somebody else, I'm probably going to use a lot of the same words if I'm going to talk about the same topic. And we kind of see that here, that many of the same words in Colossians are also used in Ephesians. And as far as the differences are concerned, 15% of Colossians is missing as different words than are used in Ephesians. So we've gone all the way up from as different as say 28%, all the way similar to 15%. So there's a lot of similarities, especially in the words that are used uniquely. And so I think that this is the evidence that they were probably sent at the same time. I know I'm stealing your time, but bear with me. And these are phrases that are used that are word for word identical. This is Galatians and Ephesians. There's some similarity there. There's like 7 phrases. There's like 6 phrases between Ephesians and Philippians. But look how many whole phrases are exactly the same word for word between Ephesians and Colossians. And so just strings of words that are exactly the same. Like that part about Tychicus. There's like 9 words that are worded exactly the same way. I think these two letters were sent to a similar part of the world, and they are both delivered by Tychicus and both delivered at roughly the same time. And so with all of that, I think that we can say this is written by Paul, written to other churches of Asia. It was a circular letter. It was written to people who are mainly Gentile. Some of them were Jewish. And there's, if you have a mixed group of people, there's going to be a need for unity between those two groups. And so that's going to be an issue that's going to have to be talked about. And there's going to be some temptation to kind of revert back. And I think that this letter would have accompanied Colossians and Philemon, all of which delivered by Tychicus. Thanks for bearing with me for that extra time. I wanted to make sure to get through all of this so we could just jump into the text next week. And so we will start with chapter 1 next week. And Lord willing, and if you could, take some time this week and just sort of read through Ephesians. And so you can kind of have some ideas and some thoughts when we talk about this next week. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. Thank you.